Welcome back to The Heat. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang will travel to the Philippines next month for an official visit and to attend the ASEAN Summit. Relations between China and the Philippines have improved greatly over the last year as leaders focus on investment and trade. In our interview with Alan Peter Cayetano, the Philippines Secretary of Foreign Affairs, he spoke candidly about sovereignty in the South China Sea. Let's talk about one area of dispute in your part of the world. That is sovereignty in the South China Sea. There's now an established code of conduct which governs activity in the South China Sea. That was a victory for diplomacy, actually. What is your view of that? How does it work?
Well, I'm very glad you asked the question that way, and you said sovereignty in the South China Sea. Because when you talk of the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, people tend to mix up all of the issues. Sovereignty or territorial rights are not divisible. You know, you cannot say it's mine, but it's also yours, or, you know, it's not like a condominium that we can have a time sharing. So it's indivisible. So what did Chairman Deng Xiaoping tell President Akori in the late 1980s when they met? He said, "Ma'am, Madam President, our generation might not be wise enough to decide territorial claims. Let's let the next generation talk about that." But there are issues of sovereignty rights, and there are issues of marine life and the resources preservation and environmental protection. There are issues of security. There are issues of cooperation in terms of search and rescue in the area, which may be discussed and where partnerships may come in without the dispute, without talking about territorial or sovereignty issues. So, for example, protecting marine life, spawning grounds of fish, or the protection of giant clams and all of these corals that are essential to marine life. You know, all the countries that are claiming can come together and say, this is all to our interest, it's in the interest of mankind, so we will declare these areas protected areas, and all of our coast guards will make sure that our nationals will not poach in these areas. So that's what we're saying, that this new era of understanding, of talking, does not solve all the problems, but open up areas of cooperation between Philippines and China in particular, Philippines and ASEAN in general, and China with individual ASEAN states. It's not always easy. There are difficult questions. There are demands back at home. There are demands in China. There are sectors that we have to deal with. We cannot sweep that under the rug, and we cannot say that these are not factors, you know. But what's our job? You know, our job is to keep the world peaceful and to put stability in our region so that everyone will gain. You know, that's not easy.
Right, you talked about terrorism a moment ago. Philippines, like China, is engaged in this fight against terrorists. Islamic militants, as you pointed out, have seized a town in Mindanao, Marawi. How is China helping you with that fight?
Oh, tremendously. Well, all of our friends and allies are helping tremendously. But it was such a great gesture for China to send us emergency assistance in the form of ammunition and weapons that our military could use, because we did not see right away how much ammunition and how well equipped the terrorists and the extremists who were trying to take over Marawi and form a province of the Daesh or of ISIS. So this China exerted extra effort. They don't use this kind of weapons, the NATO type of weapons, so they had to manufacture it with their factories running almost 24 hours a day. And it arrived in time for us to use it at crucial points. We continue to seek peace with the communists in the Philippines, with the MILF, MLF, but that doesn't mean that we can allow our military to collapse or allow our military to not be well equipped. So Chinese government continues to assist us. There's some defense cooperation and anti-terrorism cooperation in the works. Our defense ministers have also been in touch with each other. So this kind of assistance really complements Recently, I think it's 65 million pesos was given by China for the wounded soldiers of Marawi. And that does not include the $3 million that was committed for the rehabilitation of Marawi. So China and the Philippines relationship is growing, understanding is growing, trust is growing. We're engaging each other as much as we can. Despite the very busy schedule of Minister Wang Yi, he always finds time if the Philippines has to get in touch with him or any of the leaders. President Xi, upon the request of President Duterte, took a phone call. You know, things that were not happening in the past, or things that, you know, layers and approvals that are needed are happening now. You know, hotlines are in place. Our Coast Guards are talking. So the future looks good, but we can't be overconfident. There is some caution in some sectors, but we remain in touch, in good communication, and hope for the best.
Another big concern for the Philippines, and that is the war on drugs and the war against the drug trade. It's a controversial issue for the Philippines, especially some of the domestic policies that have been adopted. You've been accused of extrajudicial killings. Are you getting help from China with this?
Very much. In one aspect I can't talk much about, but it's very obvious. Of course, it's in the intelligence side. Just like, again, other traditional allies, information of where the drugs is coming from, how they're getting into the country, if it's transnational, how do we monitor and apprehend. A Chinese individual was one of the first to, a Chinese citizen, to build a mega drug center in the Philippines. China has helped us in the world stage by clearly stating to the rest of the world that, you know, you can't judge someone unless you're in their shoes. So before you make all these conclusions about the Philippines and the massive campaign against drug, take a look at what's really happening in the Philippines. But because there is a massive campaign by some members of opposition groups in the Philippines, some in the Philippine media, some in some Philippine Catholic
These are specifically about these accusations of extrajudicial killings, yeah?
Well, we had a forum recently here in Washington, you know, and of course, some were for the Democratic Party, some were for the Republicans, some were for Duterte, some were against Duterte, and they talked about 1,000 extrajudicial killings. So I asked them, how many extrajudicial killings happened in 2010, in 2011, 2012, 2013? They answered, maybe hundreds, maybe a couple of thousands. So they were all shocked when I said, the lowest was 11,500, the highest was 16,000. And this was before Duterte came in. But the previous administration, where Senator De Lima was still secretary, changed the definition and simply stated that if it's not ideological, the killing was not because of ideology or belief. If they weren't labor union leaders, or they weren't journalists, or they weren't religious leaders and activists, it's not extrajudicial killing. So they reported 80, 50, 100. You know? So they changed the definition. Then when Duterte came in, they reverted to the old definition and suddenly stating 1,000 has been killed, 2,000 have been killed, 3,000 have been killed, without saying that these killings were because of drugs and the drug lords and not because of the drug war. Now, it is true that thousands have also been killed in legitimate police operations, or at least presumed legitimate police operations, but it is because in the last 6 years, 6.5 years, there's only been 68,000 operations against drugs, because many were afraid of the politicians, of the judges, of the fiscals, prosecutors, and the police who were involved in drugs. In the first year of President Duterte, more than 90,000 operations have taken place, and the ratio is the same. For every 20 operations, there's one that gets killed. The ratio did not change, except that there are much more operations. And why do people get killed? You know, I was in an interview also recently here in Washington, and they were saying, how could 3,000 people be killed? And I told them, well, 1,000 people were killed by the US police. Are we saying that they're using excessive force or it's extrajudicial? I mean, why can't we give our police the benefit of the doubt that their life was threatened and they had to use it? And the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the WHO have stated that synthetic drugs, methamphetamine, hydrochlorides, or in the Philippines, shabu, that does lead to violence and to paranoia, which is much different from heroin, cocaine, and marijuana, where the violence is associated with those selling it, the drug syndicates, not the users. A US firm, Pew, P-E-W, said 78% of Filipinos agree with the drug war, and 68% believes that it's bearing fruit. So in the West, when you say war, they remember much of their history and the evils of war. But it's basically a campaign. It's a law enforcement campaign. So they shouldn't think of the horrors of war. They should think of how you want your streets safe. And which country, which community, which mayor, which governor does not want to have the pride of telling their constituents and telling his daughter, telling his son, you can walk in the streets at any time of the day and you'll be safe.
Minister, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, and please let me know, if you want to do anything in the Philippines, because it's open and transparent and you can see what is really happening in our country. Thank you very much, Anand.
Thank you, sir. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.